Hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with me, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan. This week, we're joined by Dan Brumberg, a professor at Georgetown University and a very well-respected commentator and knowledgeable scholar on matters Middle Eastern, so we're delighted to welcome later. First, we'll have some headlines.
In This Week in the Middle East, Egyptian, Israeli and US officials are continuing in-person and remote meetings to break a deadlock in negotiations about a truce in the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Police have clashed with students critical of Israel's war in Gaza, with nearly 550 arrests made over the protests in the last week across major US universities. China will host Palestinian unity talks between Hamas and Fatah. In an article in the Middle East Economic Survey, OPEC Secretary General Haytham Al-Ghais said that the end of oil is not in sight, as the pace of energy demand growth means that alternatives cannot replace it at the needed scale, and the focus should be on cutting emissions, not oil use. And Dubai's ruler Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum has approved a new passenger terminal in Al Maktoum International Airport, which will be the largest in the world, with a capacity of up to 260 million passengers and 5 times the size of Dubai International Airport.
Well, that's going for yet another record in Dubai. Meanwhile, let me bring my friend Eddie onto the stage. Hello, Eddie.
Hello, Francis.
And I introduce Daniel Brumberg, a professor of government at Georgetown University in Washington and author of Reinventing Khomeini, The Struggle for Reform in Iran. And Dan, you've been a commentator on Iran for a long time, haven't you?
Absolutely, more decades than I want to acknowledge. I'm happy to be here and to join you and Eddie in this discussion.
Well, I'm delighted you're here. Perhaps we can start with the comment that you made in one of the Middle East blogs, where you wrote commenting that the New York Times had got a very good article that the Israeli attack on Damascus consulate, the Iranian consulate in Damascus, was not intended to trigger that response that it achieved. Yet, perhaps to the benefit of Netanyahu, it did trigger the response. But you think it was accidental or deliberate?
Well, I mean, I don't. My point in this debate is that we don't really know, right? And that the assumption that of intent extrapolated from the consequence is always a dangerous way to go analytically. And there are several possible explanations. The Times ran a long piece in which it suggested that the Israelis had miscalculated and that the decision-making process was not designed to trigger a wider war, which I think my guess from what I know, and I've talked to some Israeli colleagues who have been involved in sort of the decision-making process, is that from the point of view of the Israeli security apparatus, when they have the means and an opportunity, they strike. It's a doctrine of action. You could say it's a doctrine of action accompanied by potential stupidity, but it is very much a kind of bureaucratic response. And I think that that judging from the piece in the Times and also the extraordinary debate in Israel and the press about that decision, that they didn't anticipate the full implications. It seems ridiculous since it was technically on Iranian territory. But the Israelis have this reflexive sort of approach, which is when you get, and in this particular case, when you have 6 of the leading Islamic Revolutionary Guard leaders from the entire region in one place, and the lesson for Iran is do not assemble them in one place like that. But when you do have that opportunity and they're all in one place, they struck and they struck hard. But the consequence, of course, was, as I wrote, that the basic sort of rules of the game of the complex and fragile rules of deterrence between Israel and Iran that were operated thus far via Iran's allies, most importantly Hezbollah and Lebanon, those rules were essentially broken and now have been redrafted or rewritten, with Iran responding in a way that was meant to sort of threaten but not drag Iran into a war with Israel. So the rules of the game have remained the same, but the arena of conflict has shifted in a dangerous way.
Eddie.
Yes, I'm interested in. I mean, they're not the mainstream commentators, but Professor John Mearsheimer and probably Charles Freeman. I think you remember him. He was U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and these. I mean, they're both outliers in terms of foreign policy, Middle East analysis, but they both said that they believe that the Iranian response, the scale of it, is actually neutralized Israel's position as the having escalatory dominance or supremacy, and that by that, I mean, it's not me. That was John Mearsheimer and Chas Friedman said that Israel can no longer assume that they're in the position where its opponents in the region, and this in case is Iran, they're now in a position where they can escalate with the confidence that they used to be able to. Is that a view that you?
That's probably reasonable. I agree in that regard with my old professor John Mearsheimer on that particular score. Other things I do not agree with him on, but I think that again, everybody's reading the tea leaves, right? And so the same question that we asked about Israeli intentions now have to be applied to Iran and the opaque Iranian sort of decision-making process. Iran was clearly restrained, but they got enough missiles through, right, to demonstrate that they could do some real damage if they wanted to. So whether or not, who has the dominance is a matter of how you read the tea leaves and your perspective. But I think the essential point that I'm trying to get at, without getting drawn into that particular debate, and John is a much more of an expert on these matters than I am, is that the rules of the fragile rules of deterrence have been effectively reestablished. Now they intersect with the regional conflicts, and particularly between Hezbollah and Israel, but and they've been reestablished in a way that creates the possibility of a wider war with Iran. But I think the key issue is that both Israel and Iran don't want that, and don't really want to be dragged into that conflict. Part of the problem for Israel is that, and while there was ample information to suggest that the Israelis' response to the Iranian attack was initially planned to be much harder, the Israelis don't have the munitions required to do the kind of damage to Iran's nuclear facilities that they would have to do if they would strike at them. So there's a series of very complex calculations that I think are going to maintain this fragile balance.
Which brings me on to, am I muted? Can you hear me?
No,
yes.
I can hear you.
Yeah, which brings me on to US Middle East policy. And that's one of the questions. We're sitting in London, and you're right in the heart of the policy formulation community in the United States. To what extent has US foreign policy or Middle East policy absorbed this new information? To what extent is there any evidence that it's been absorbed and it's beginning to influence policymakers?
Well, I mean, if you mean policymakers in the White House, I think that obviously this kind of escalation has only sort of reinforced the concern that somehow the U.S. has to be more active and the Secretary of State is now doing just that and trying to sort of restrain the regional players and find some truce in Gaza. I don't think that these events, no matter how dangerous they are, change the fundamental contradiction in the Biden administration policy on Gaza, which is, on the one hand, they want a ceasefire and as that can last as long as possible. On the other hand, they don't oppose Israel's desire to destroy Hamas and will not restrain it ultimately, even as the U.S. demands that Israel take a lot more steps on the humanitarian issues and so on. And I think that contradiction, which has run through the heart of the Biden approach from the beginning, is still very much there. And it is that tension that really allows that for Bibi, the prime minister in Israel, to sort of continue at least signaling that he might go into Rafah and so on. And so that's still there. So the escalation with Iran has certainly got folks' attention. I can't tell you whether it's changed the U.S. policy in Iran, probably not. but it has certainly heightened the concerns about a regional configuration.
And yes, because I mean, this contradiction, which I think it's for any dispassionate observer is pretty obvious, and although it's difficult to voice that matter, at least in the public arena, without getting a storm of,
well, I mean, it's been pointed out in many, op-eds and in, Times of Post and so on, and I probably less on the Hill, but there you don't, I'm not looking for rational discussion. But and so people are aware of it, and I'm sure that Biden is aware of it too, and he feels that he has to live with it because of the situation, because of the circumstances of October 7th, the atrocities, because of the trauma that was registered in Israeli society, the perception of an existential threat, which is deeply embedded in the response of everyday Israelis. So it's not, I mean, foreign policy is often the art of maintaining contradictory priorities in one policy. It's nothing new, but in this case, of course, the contradiction really ultimately is enabling this war to go on in ways that the U.S. doesn't want it to do.
That's the war in Gaza.
And of course, there's the domestic angle. There's the pressure from the Republicans. There's the divisions among Democrats on Israel now, which are very much out there. And that also complicates that response too, because immediately when you talk about putting pressure on Israel, then it becomes a domestic political issue that is not between the Republicans and Democrats, but within the Democratic Party. So it's a fraught situation, and the people who are paying the biggest price for that are the Palestinians first and foremost, of course, and then of course Israelis who are frozen in this state of fear and trauma, and who cannot see beyond that fear and trauma and anger to the humanity of the situation. So we have I call it a war of negation now. Apart from the war itself, it's a war of denial and negation in both communities, reflected here, by the way, in the United States, and it's terrible. And I don't think I think that the chances for bringing a ceasefire ultimately depend, of course, on Biden. And as closer we get to an election, the less incentive he has to put on pressure.
Well, I'm glad you read that. Last question. I'm glad you mentioned Biden and the election and the possibility, let's face it, it's a possibility or a probability that Trump will be back in the White House. What difference do you think that would make?
It's a hard...
Eddie, not a fair question.
Well, it's a fair question.
Necessary.
Because Trump's behavior and his actions and policies are very much a function of his own intense and narcissism. So there's no, this is not a rational man in any sense of the word. And the people around him, their job is not to get in the way and help him cope with his own sort of emotional distress. I put it nicely. So I think that it's very unpredictable. I mean, what will happen, and some of this will also depend on the domestic situation in Israel and how long Bibi lasts. And no one should ever count him out. So it's I wouldn't. By the way, I mean, I think despite all the polling and everything else, I think the pathology of the American political system is that it's going to come down to a few key states, Michigan among them, Pennsylvania, and of course the Gaza situation has created great consternation. And if he loses any one of these critical states, Biden will lose the election. So that too is an element. There you have an incentive for him to sort of come up with some sort of diplomatic initiative that shuts this down or produces a truce before we get too close to that. So the election could work both ways, precisely because you have such divisions in the Democratic Party. And if Biden could stand up there and show that he's the leader that is now going to try to really find a way, not only for a truce, but for diplomacy to reemerge. This would help cool the waters a little bit. But the Palestinian American community is so angry. My colleagues in that community, who I work with and who I know, have always been, the Israeli equivalent of peaceniks. They're the ones who who negotiated and so on, they are so profoundly disillusioned, so enraged by what has happened, which is completely understandable. That there's a sense of the desire for retribution and to see Biden suffer. But in the end, if Biden loses, collectively, a lot of people are going to suffer, and I don't think it's going to do the Palestinians any good. But I understand the rage and the anger and the bitterness, because every day we see what's going on screen, and people who are rational and moderate have just become they're filled with a sense of hopelessness now.
But what credence do you put? We say that Biden has to come up with an idea and in some way have a policy out there to cool the thing down, as you said. But what credence do you put on the plans which seem to be emerging from the State Department of this a new defense deal with Saudi Arabia, some kind of arrangement with Palestine, yet to be declared how on earth that would work, and then some and mix in the hint of a sort of Israeli-Saudi American defense network, which emerged when the Iranians missile attack happened. But it seems to be that they're building several different bits of pieces there.
Yeah, well, there's this kind of pragmatism, fix-it kind of sense, and that's always been part of the American policy apparatus, right? When you're trying to fix something that's been so broken for so long, it's hard to find a way out. And let's not forget that the Saudis only, 9-10 months ago were hardly mentioning the Palestinians.
Yes,
they seem to signal a readiness to normalize relations with Israel without necessarily pushing on the Palestinian front. Suddenly, after October 7th, you were getting MBS is giving us a different line. But the reality is that I think that's an aspiration. That's the frame. Tom Friedman had a piece in the New York Times yesterday when he said it's Rafah or Riyadh, right?
Yes.
And I think and that's the choice that Bibi has. That may be
you would agree with that choice?
Well, I think it's a bit of a simplification, because the difficulty, apart from sort of the immediate obstacles, the difficulty of the Riyadh peace regional kind of framework is that the conditions on the ground, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and the conditions in the Israeli coalition that is dominated, it's as if, imagine for a moment that in the United States we had David Duke from the KKK is, leading the American military. I mean, you've got Gvir, and you've got hideous people. They don't make Bibi look much better, but they're, and then my sense, I'll put it bluntly, is that any Israeli leader who signs on to that deal is going to be assassinated. I think that's how far Israel has gone to the right, and average Israelis.
Rabin was.
Yes, average Israelis who would want a two-state solution and so on are fearful, and it's now dominated by one sort of voice, and Bibi's priority is to survive politically. So there's a huge obstacle structurally to that kind of, but it remains the aspiration of the U.S. and it does remain. Israel has a choice between sort of the war footing and the land footing versus the diplomatic footing, whatever that means, and that's not an easy choice politically. But so I think it's something that the Biden administration would like to see happen. It's not happening anytime soon. And it would require a change in Israeli leadership. So,
there was a comment I read this week saying that the Israelis have no strategy to deal with the Arabs. They only have tactics.
No, but it's always been. What is one of the terrible aspects of the situation is both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, they're only tactics. There's no strategy.
Yeah.
To this day, my colleagues who work on Hamas are still trying to figure out what it was trying to achieve on October 7th. What was the goal? And I haven't found any. Everybody filters that question through their own assumptions and prejudices. That's hard to avoid because we don't know, and there are many possible explanations. But so and that's why this thing is denigrated into a kind of existential war of elimination and negation on both sides. So Hamas leaders who were behind the attack said, you know what? given the chance, we would do this 3, 4, 5 times. We, no apologies, right?
Yeah.
Initially, they tried to deny that civilians were targeted. That's ridiculous, of course. And then Israeli public opinion, which is, our very existence is threatened. So whatever happens, this is the way it is. So, it is the dominance of tactics over strategy. I mean, I suppose you could say that in some sense that's not a new thing. But now the consequences are even greater.
But switching our attention north, so far, Hezbollah has not taken any major action, and it looks as though there will. I mean, I would hate to say that there is a sort of an agreement. There's going to be some kind of standoff, but it looks as though that standoff may continue because it's in really no one's interest.
Well, it's a question of what I call mutually assured catastrophe. To take it from the Cold War, in which neither side can afford a full-fledged war because, and of course, in a strange and grotesque way, what's happened to Gaza is certainly a reminder to Lebanese of the potential consequences of a full-fledged war with Israel. And Israel, of course, as a deterrent, has indicated what they're ready to do. You would expect that. And I suppose they might, fulfill that expectation if attacked. So, of course, now Hezbollah a few days ago hit Akko, hit a military installation in Israel. That's pretty far south. That's the farthest south they've hit so far. And so the red lines are sort of changing. They could change, but I think you're right that they don't want a full scale war. But things could get out of control, and then you have an entire population along the northern border that have been displaced and are living in small hotels and along in Tel Aviv, and whose livelihoods are ruined and who lost their jobs and who are despairing. And the irony of the situation of a country built on the question of exile, right, is that you have internal exiles. You have people who find themselves exiled, and for Hezbollah, that's a huge achievement. So along two major boundaries of Israel and Arab states, you have people who have just left their homes and are afraid to go back, and so that just amplifies the situation, the fears, the sense of existential dread. But nevertheless, and so what Israel wants is not only some sort of ceasefire along the border in Lebanon, but an agreement. Hochstein, as you know, we have somebody out there trying to negotiate, and he's somebody. His background is actually, as I understand it, in energy. But
I think he's the man who negotiated the marine deal and the gas arrangement.
That was an extraordinary moment where rationality prevailed. Will it prevail now? I think it's an interesting question because it could. And so Hezbollah will be always looking to see. While Hezbollah is not a creature of Iran, of course, they're close allies. I don't like the term proxy. It doesn't really get to what the nature of the relationship. But and so they're looking to see if the Iran-Israel context stabilizes. That will provide, because Iran was very much opposed to Hezbollah getting involved and escalating with Israel, and made it very clear, as I've written about, that they should stand back from pursuing a wider war with Israel and push very hard. And I think that's what Iran still wants.
So do you think that, as you wrote, that Iran is following this sort of no war, no victory strategy? So do you think that the Hamas attack and Hezbollah's moderation, let me say, and even the Houthi joining in has slightly caught Iran on the hop? It's not some master plan, or it's just kind of juggling, or it's out of control.
I think. I mean, we're looking at an opaque, the black box of policy making and so on, and you gentlemen know this very well. But Houthis are one thing, because, as I wrote in a piece, they're not tethered to any actual state in that sense, and don't have quite the same constraints that Hezbollah or the Iraqi forces, Shia forces in Iraq have. But I think Iran was caught unaware or surprised by the attack by Hamas. They certainly helped to make it possible. There's no question about it. Despite all the talk for these years about Gaza being open open prison and so on, Hamas was able to create a city underneath Gaza, right? And to divert all this enormous amount of resources to that project. You can raise questions about what it ultimately thought it was doing, but it did that, and I think it kept the circle of people who knew about the attack coming, very, very closed. And Iran at the time and Hezbollah was not expecting a regional war, and so Iran's response rhetorically was to, of course, embrace Hamas and so on, but at the same time to push its allies, particularly in Lebanon, not to pursue a wider war, because in part the Iranian, I've also written that the no war, no peace formula that Iran pursues is all about regime survival, first and foremost, and what the Iranians see as their outward defense strategy, as it's sometimes called, which of course from the regional perspective looks like an aggressive strategy. But I think all of that was put into some danger by a war that came and struck when they weren't quite ready, and they've been dealing with that ever since. And they have pushed their allies in Iraq, who of course went after U.S. forces. They hope to stand back. They've pressured Hezbollah. Pressuring their allies in Yemen has been a bit more complicated. But I think that I think that the strange thing is that Khamenei, the supreme leader, is often the sort of adult in the room. He's been around for a long time. He's been, and he, despite his own ideological proclivities, he's a very calculated, rational actor. Mearsheimer would appreciate that, and so he doesn't, the Iranian leadership has been under constant criticism from within the regime since the assassination of Soleimani under the previous U.S. administration, that they have failed to reestablish deterrence. And so there's a lot of public criticism. You can go online and see it of the government, and so there are voices there who would like to go full out with Israel, and Khamenei says let's think about state interests. Really, I mean, that's where he's coming from. So he is often the adult in the room because his concern is to establish the premise for his succession and to stabilize the internal political arena, to get his replacement and the institutions around him sustained and in a way that keeps them there for the next 100 years.
But Dan, do you think he's managed that? Because he's he's 85, so the succession is a live issue, and I suppose the Guardian Council has been packing the Assembly of Experts with hardline conservatives or principalists.
Well,
the candidates look a bit thin on the ground. I mean, either his son maybe, or President Raisi, or who's likely to take over?
Taba, as you mentioned. I don't, I'm not, although I am the son of a criminologist who used to sort of look at who's standing next to whom, as they used to say. I think it's very hard to say. I don't think it's people.
That's why we're asking you.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to give you a discounted rate because I don't have any crystal ball here, and I think that Mujtaba is it would look really weird for the son of the supreme leader to take over. I mean, this after all the kind of Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic rejected the kingship model or whatever, or some version of that. Raisi has much more political status. Whoever is in there, however, I would say will be much more dependent on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard than any previous supreme leader, because increasingly, as the political institutions of Iran that were established after the revolution have been weakened and discredited, it's the security apparatus that has become the sort of chief power house next to the office of the supreme leader, which is a tremendously huge office which is well funded and has its own institutions, security apparatus. So there's an alliance between what are essentially the two institutions, both of which depend on are defined by a security apparatus. So anybody who's in there is not going to have. Nobody ever had the charismatic legitimacy of Khomeini. Khamenei kept trying to sort of insist he had it for decades, and everybody understood. By the way, I've been in the room where it happened. I watched Khamenei give a speech in the mausoleum of Khomeini in 2001, and the thing that I noticed, because I was sitting about 50 yards from Khamenei, was that first of all, his guys came out there and they got everybody rallied up, and then he had a list of points to make, and he went through them. And then Khamenei came out there and sort of did his, false charismatic dance. I mean, it's an institution that depends not so much on the personal qualities of the leader anymore, but on the institution of the leader, which is a huge office, right? So I think that that's what they're trying to establish. And in some sense, when we sort of get involved in a discussion of the successionship, we are ignoring the sort of continuity of the institutional states that were created by Khomeini and which have endured.
Eddie, jump in.
Yeah, just looking at the regime in Iran. To what extent is the ideology, the revolutionary ideology associated with Khomeini and his successors, to what extent is that still in place? Because I was reading, it was a Twitter post, I don't know if you saw it. It was a guy who claimed he spent weeks in Israel interviewing senior people at the IDF. And he went through, he said, I'm distilling the IDF view. One is they're all hawks. That's the first thing he said. They're all hawks. Even if, obviously,
there. Yeah.
He said, which confirms my view. If Netanyahu goes, it doesn't make any difference. Hawks are in charge. Secondly, he went through the three enemies. One was the jihadis in a hurry, he called them, which is IS. And then the Muslim Brotherhood. And then he said, the third enemy that they see is Iran. They see it as a revolutionary force that wants to remake the world order completely, and therefore is an existential threat. But how significant is the ideology now, the communist ideology of revolution, replacing existing systems with Islamic Republic, spreading the word of God? How significant is that still when it really matters in Iran?
I mean, ideology is important in a very significant way, and that is that the revolution and the institutions of the republic were based on certain ideological principles that they can't give up without undermining one key prop of the revolution. So that is one reason why the hardliners want to have continued conflict with the U.S. and Iran, because to give that up, that's why Khatami was viewed as an existential threat by the hardliners, because he basically said, I'm done with this. I want a dialogue of civilization. And the hardliners, we're not anywhere if we don't have conflict with Israel and Iran. So I think that's very important. And you have a well-organized military force, which has its own institutions of indoctrination, its own universities. And so you have a very powerful minority that has guns and ideas. So it's very important in that sense. I think that Iran's foreign policy, Kissinger once said that Iran has to decide whether it wants to be a state or an idea, right? That's true, by the way, of every state. I mean, that's not so unusual. But in Iran, it's particularly powerful in the sense that Iran is very rational and calculated, and often it makes alliances based on its state interests. Yet there is this powerful impulse which is maintained by the state, and so all these things coexist. And the absence of U.S.-Iranian diplomacy really, of course, only empowers those who want the ideology to be prominent. So that's still very much a case. The Iranians, Khamenei was famously quoted some weeks ago as saying that in 40 years Israel may be gone. And I think that the Iranian aspiration is because they think that Israel is some sort of, this has come somehow the dominant narrative now, that this, that it's just a fake, it's not real. And just provide a certain pressure from the north and the south and this and that, and somehow it's going to go. I think, that kind of view of things is something that very much motivates the hardliners in the regime. On the first, it's curious that in the first line of Khomeini's book, Islamic Government, in the first or second paragraph, he said the Jews have always been our enemies. It's right there. So there's a lot of elements that go into sort of Iranian foreign policy. I don't take seriously the idea that they're in any way going after a bomb in order to destroy Israel. I think that as soon as Iran had the capacity to make and deliver one nuclear weapon, Israel would strike. and they would do so with U.S. support. So the pursuit of nuclear weapon capacity is dangerous for Iran. But I've been involved in second track diplomacy meetings with Iranians over the years in Denmark and in Canada and other places. And one time it was with a very high official, was with who was an advisor to Ahmadinejad, the former president. I said, you know what? I mean, why do you constantly repeat this statement that you want this Zionist enemy to disappear, that you want to destroy it, and so on? By the way, the official Iranian position now is that if there's a ceasefire and the refugees that were pushed out of Israel, Palestine in 1948 can come back, that will be fine. I mean, so it's it's extraordinary that they can't let go of this, and they can't let go of this in part because it is part of the ideology of the state, but it's only part of a very complex picture. And of course, from the Israeli point of view, when they look at it, that's all they see, and they feel genuinely, threatened by that. But the structure of the Iranian government is that there's nobody who has the kind of democratic credentials that Khatami had when he was president to talk about a different vision, and he did it. And he paid for it politically, didn't he?
And Ahmadinejad replaced him.
Yeah, and and of course then Ahmadinejad changed his tune when he became, that's another story. But it is still an issue, very much. That's a lot.
Yet this same regime is willing to reach out to the Saudis.
Of course, yes. I mean, the Iranian regime, the Iranian perspective, that's what I'm saying about rationality, is that keep as many options open as possible. So talks with the UAE, China was the regional player or the global player that helped birth the reconciliation or normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yet we'll see how the Iranians respond if indeed the Biden plan sort of begins to look like reality. But the Iranians are very good at knowing that their best bet is to sort of have as many potential friends and potential sort of intersecting diplomatic openings as possible, and to have that and live at the same time with an ideology which at its core suggests not much of a willingness to sort of strategically resolve these issues. And one would hope that maybe China at some point would play a more productive role in sort of responding to that. But so far, the Chinese, for all their bravado, have not demonstrated that they're much of a key player in this situation.
Well, Dan, with that vaguely hopeful thought that Iran is willing to make friends despite its ideologies, I'd like to thank you very much for your insight and for your thoughts. It's been fascinating, and thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. I was delighted.
Thank you, Dan. Great talking. Keep
your fingers crossed.
Great.
Bye.
And with that, I say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.